On the cobblestone streets of Vatican City, an old man named Arthur Brandt limped toward the Sistine Chapel, his breath shallow, heart heavy with both fear and excitement. His dying wish had brought him here. A war veteran haunted by secrets buried for decades. A whispered clue from his past led him to the Vatican Archives. But what he uncovered, a weathered parchment hidden in plain sight, would shake the foundations of history and faith, revealing a truth the world was never meant to know. Arthur Brandt, an 82-year-old war veteran with tired eyes and a frail body, lay on the hospital bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. He had spent months there, battling the cancer that now gnawed at him, leaving him with only weeks to live. The doctors offered kind words, but Arthur didn't care for platitudes. What consumed him was a mystery left unresolved. A ghost from his past whispering for closure. 3 days ago, a nurse delivered an envelope to his room. The envelope was unremarkable, plain white with no return address, but its contents sent chills through him. Inside was a single piece of aged parchment with a string of numbers and letters scrawled in faded ink. Arthur recognized it instantly. A military cipher from World War II, one he hadn't seen in decades. The letter bore a short, ominous message. "The truth you seek lies in the Vatican. Time is running out." Arthur's hands trembled as he read the words over and over. His mind raced back to his years as a codebreaker during the war. He and his closest friend, John Jack Mallory, had been part of a classified mission that unearthed a Nazi cache of documents. Among them was a file labeled Project Angelus. They were ordered to destroy it immediately, but Jack hesitated, whispering, "This changes everything." Before Arthur could question him, the file was gone, and so was Jack, presumed dead in a bombing. Now, decades later, the cipher in the letter was unmistakably Jack's handiwork. Could he still be alive? And why the Vatican? Arthur had little time for answers, but his curiosity burned brighter than his fear. Against his doctor's protests, he signed himself out of the hospital, bought a plane ticket to Rome, and embarked on what he knew would be his final journey. The flight to Vatican City was grueling. His weak heart and fragile lungs strained against the cabin air, but Arthur pressed on. By the time he landed, he could barely walk without leaning on his cane. The cobblestone streets of Rome greeted him with chilly December air, and the sight of St. Peter's Basilica rising majestically above the skyline filled him with awe and foreboding. Arthur checked into a modest guest house near the Vatican and began deciphering the parchment. It wasn't just a random code, it was a set of coordinates and a date. The coordinates pointed directly to the Vatican Archives, while the date was marked as the following day. Arthur had no credentials, no official invitation, and no strength for confrontation. Yet, quitting was never an option. The next morning, Arthur stood at the Vatican gates, his cane in one hand and the parchment in the other. Tourists bustled around him, snapping photos and marveling at the architecture, but Arthur's focus was elsewhere. He had one shot to gain entry, and he had no plan but to improvise. A man in a long black cassock approached him. Father Miguel, a mid-ranking cleric overseeing visitor admissions. Arthur showed him the parchment, explaining in a hoarse voice that it was a matter of urgent historical significance. Father Miguel hesitated, scrutinizing the frail old man before him. There was something in Arthur's eyes, desperation mixed with determination, that convinced him to take a chance. "Follow me," he said quietly. Arthur's pulse quickened as they walked through the Vatican's labyrinthine corridors. The polished marble floors and towering frescoed ceilings seemed to close in on him, a stark reminder of the church's vast power and secrecy. Father Miguel led him to an unassuming wooden door with a brass plaque that read, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archives. "You have 20 minutes, Father Miguel said, unlocking the door. "I risk much by letting you in." Arthur nodded, gratitude and anxiety warring within him. The room was cavernous, filled with row after row of ancient tomes and scrolls. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint scent of parchment filled his nostrils. He didn't have time to marvel at the collection. Instead, he pulled out the parchment and cross-referenced it with the Archives catalog system. His search led him to a particular shelf marked Sistine C. Arthur hobbled over, his cane clicking against the stone floor. The shelf held a weathered, leather-bound volume with a Latin title that translated to The Conquered of the Heavens. As he flipped through its pages, he found a folded piece of paper tucked inside, a cipher identical to the one Jack had sent him. Scrawled on it was another message: "Seek the floor beneath the Sistine Chapel." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. His 20 minutes were up, and Father Miguel knocked on the door. Hiding the cipher in his coat pocket, Arthur returned the book to the shelf and exited the room. "Thank you," he whispered to Father Miguel, who gave him a curt nod before hurrying him out. That night, Arthur lay in his guest house, staring at the cipher. It was clear that Jack, or someone connected to him, had left these clues for Arthur to find. But why? And what lay beneath the Sistine Chapel? As the city outside his window slept, Arthur resolved to find out. His dying body ached, but his mind burned with purpose. This was his final mission, and he would see it through, even if it cost him his last breath. The sun rose as Arthur Brandt limped through the bustling square of Vatican City. Tourists admired St. Peter's Basilica, snapping photos, but Arthur moved with purpose. His body screamed for rest, yet his mind pushed forward. The cipher was clear. His next step lay beneath the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel, a masterpiece of divine art, was the last place he imagined secrets would lie. But Jack's ciphers had never failed him. Even so, Arthur couldn't simply walk in and pry up floorboards. He needed a way inside. By mid-morning, Arthur lingered at a cafe near the Vatican walls. He ordered coffee he didn't drink and unfolded the cipher. Its meaning was undeniable: beneath the Sistine Chapel. He didn't notice the figure until it sat across from him. "You're Arthur Brandt," said a soft voice. Arthur stiffened, his grip tightening on the parchment. Across the table sat a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a gray habit. Her calm face contrasted with sharp, observant eyes. "Who are you?" Arthur asked. "Sister Lucia," she replied. "I'm here to help." Arthur's suspicion flared. "Help? How do you know?" "The person who sent you the letter reached out to me, too," she interrupted. "You're not the only one searching for the truth." Arthur studied her face. "If that's true, what's beneath the chapel?" Lucia leaned forward. "A chamber hidden for centuries. My family has guarded its secret, but someone in the Vatican wants it erased." Arthur felt a pang of doubt, but also urgency. "Why are you helping me?" "Because the truth deserves to be known." Arthur hesitated, but realized he had no better option. "Fine. How do we get inside?" "Tonight," Lucia whispered, "after evening prayers, meet me at the side entrance of the Sistine Chapel." The hours crawled. Arthur spent the afternoon at his guest house poring over the cipher. The message was simple but carried decades of secrecy. He wondered if Jack had worked with Lucia's family. Why had Jack vanished? And what was so important that it required this level of concealment? By nightfall, Arthur was exhausted but resolute. He wrapped himself in a coat and made his way to the rendezvous. The streets were quieter now, the cold air stinging his lungs. When he reached the entrance, Lucia was waiting, her gray habit blending into the shadows. "Follow me," she whispered. Lucia led Arthur through a side door into the Sistine Chapel. The space was eerily silent, its frescoes bathed in faint moonlight. Arthur craned his neck, marveling at Michelangelo's masterpiece, but Lucia tugged his sleeve. "We don't have much time," she said, guiding him to the center of the chapel. "The chamber is directly beneath us." Lucia knelt, pulling a small tool from her sleeve. With precision, she pried up a section of the marble floor, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. "You've done this before," Arthur muttered. Lucia glanced at him. "Once. I swore never to return." They descended, their footsteps echoing against stone walls. The air grew colder, damp earth filling Arthur's nostrils. At the bottom, they entered a cavernous room lit by faint lanterns. The walls were lined with ancient murals, their vibrant colors dulled by time. Arthur's breath caught. The chamber held artifacts, scrolls, paintings, sculptures, centuries old. At the center stood a stone pedestal with a single leather-bound book. Lucia approached it reverently. "This is what they want to destroy." Arthur stepped closer. The book's cover bore a Latin inscription, Veritas Angelorum, the truth of angels. "What is it?" Arthur asked. "A record," Lucia replied, "of miracles that were manufactured." Arthur felt his stomach drop. "Manufactured? You're saying they were fake?" Lucia nodded grimly. Some of the Church's greatest miracles weren't acts of God. They were created to consolidate power. Arthur's mind reeled. The implications were staggering. If the book's contents were true, it would shatter centuries of faith. He wondered how many people had risked their lives to keep this secret buried, and how many more had died for it. Before he could process it further, a sound echoed from the staircase above. "They found us," Lucia whispered. Arthur's heart pounded as footsteps descended. He grabbed the book, tucking it under his coat. "Is there another way out?" Lucia pointed to a narrow passage. "That way. Hurry." They sprinted down the passage, shadows flickering against the walls. Arthur's lungs burned, but he pushed forward. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Lucia pressed a hidden lever, and a stone door slid shut, cutting off the noise. Arthur leaned against the wall, gasping. "How do you know all this?" Lucia hesitated. "My family has been part of the Vatican's hidden history for centuries. But we can't talk now. We need to get that book to safety." Arthur nodded, clutching the book tightly. For the first time in years, he felt alive. The truth was within his grasp, but the journey was far from over. The air in the narrow tunnel was damp and heavy, the dim flicker of Lucia's flashlight their only guide. Arthur stumbled forward, clutching the leather-bound book against his chest. Behind them, faint echoes of their pursuers' footsteps lingered, but the thick stone walls muffled the sounds. "This tunnel, where does it lead?" Arthur asked, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Lucia didn't turn. "It connects to an abandoned crypt beneath the Vatican gardens. If we can reach it, we might lose them." "And after that?" Arthur pressed. Lucia glanced over her shoulder. "We find someone we can trust, someone who can protect the book." Arthur scoffed. "You think anyone will believe what's in here? Or care to protect it?" "They'll believe when they see the evidence," Lucia said. "This book isn't just words, Arthur. It's centuries of lies." Arthur's lips tightened. He wasn't a man of deep faith, but even he felt the weight of her words. The book wasn't just history. It was a weapon. The enormity of it all made his knees weak. Lucia suddenly stopped, holding up her hand. Arthur froze, straining to hear. At first, silence, then a faint rhythmic tapping echoed ahead. "They're coming from the other direction," she whispered. Arthur felt his stomach twist. "We're trapped." "No," Lucia said. "Follow me." She pressed her hand against the damp wall, searching. Her fingers found a hidden latch. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow alcove barely large enough for two. "In here," she said, ushering Arthur inside. Once inside, she pulled the panel shut, plunging them into darkness. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. Arthur held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would give them away. Through the thin wall, he heard fragments of conversation. "They must have taken the tunnel to the crypt," said one voice. "If not, alert the guards." Lucia's hand found Arthur's in the dark, her grip steadying. They waited, motionless, as the footsteps faded. When silence returned, Lucia slid the panel open. "We have to move quickly," she said. Arthur followed, his legs trembling as adrenaline coursed through him. "Who are these people? Vatican guards?" Lucia shook her head. "No, they're part of a secret order, the Custodes Veritatis. Their purpose is to protect the Church's most dangerous secrets by any means necessary." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. "Secrets like this book." "Exactly," Lucia said. "They won't stop until they have it." The tunnel grew narrower as they pressed on. The air turned stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust. Arthur's legs screamed in protest, but he kept moving. He had come too far to give up now. Finally, they reached the end. A heavy wooden door stood before them, its surface warped with age. Lucia pressed her ear against it, listening intently. Satisfied no one waited beyond, she pushed it open. The crypt was darker than the tunnel, its air thick with decay. Rows of stone sarcophagi lined the walls, their surfaces covered in Latin inscriptions. Lucia moved quickly, weaving between the tombs. "This way," she whispered, leading Arthur toward a narrow staircase at the far end. As they climbed, Arthur felt the weight of the book grow heavier. The further they went, the more dangerous their mission became. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about surviving long enough to share it. When they emerged, the cool night air hit Arthur like a wave. They were in a secluded corner of the Vatican gardens, the towering walls of the city looming nearby. For a moment, Arthur allowed himself to hope they had escaped. The hope vanished. A beam of light swept across the garden, followed by a barked command in Italian. Arthur turned to see armed men rushing toward them, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. "Run!" Lucia shouted, grabbing Arthur's arm. Arthur's old legs protested with every step, but the sight of the armed men gave him all the motivation he needed. He followed Lucia, weaving between hedges and statues. The men's shouts grew louder, closing the distance. Finally, they reached the garden wall. Lucia scanned the area, her eyes landing on a narrow iron gate. "Through there," she said, shoving Arthur forward. The gate led to a quiet alley outside the Vatican walls. Arthur collapsed against the stone, his chest heaving. Lucia stood guard, scanning the shadows for signs of their pursuers. "We can't stay here," she said. "They'll search the area soon." Arthur nodded, clutching the book tightly. "Where do we go?" "There's someone I trust," Lucia said. "A journalist. He'll know what to do." Arthur frowned. "A journalist? You think they'll protect this?" Lucia met his gaze. "It's not just about protecting it, Arthur. It's about making sure the world knows the truth." Arthur stared at the book in his hands, its worn leather cover a reminder of the burden he now carried. The truth was dangerous, but he had come too far to turn back. He nodded. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Lucia led the way, disappearing into the Roman night. The truth was waiting to be revealed, and Arthur was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The narrow streets of Rome were eerily quiet as Lucia and Arthur navigated the maze of alleys under the cover of night. Arthur's legs screamed with every step, but Lucia's brisk pace left no room for hesitation. She occasionally glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp and wary. "Where are we going?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. "To someone who can help us," Lucia replied. "A journalist named Matteo Ricci. He's worked with whistleblowers and isn't afraid to take on the Vatican." Arthur frowned, clutching the book tighter. "You trust him?" "I do," Lucia said. "He's risked everything to expose corruption. If anyone can get this story out, it's him." They turned into a narrow street lined with shuttered shops. A lone street lamp cast shadows across the cobblestones. Lucia stopped in front of a plain door, rapping the knocker 3 times in a distinct rhythm. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his early 40s with disheveled hair and a tired expression. His eyes widened when he saw Lucia. "Sister Lucia, what are you—" His gaze shifted to Arthur and the book. "What's going on?" "No time to explain out here," Lucia said, pushing past him into the dimly lit apartment. "We need your help." Matteo bolted the door, turning to face them. "You're being followed?" "Yes," Lucia said, "by people who will do anything to stop us, but we have something they can't destroy." Arthur placed the book on Matteo's desk. The journalist leaned over it, reading the Latin inscription on the cover. "Veritas Angelorum," Matteo murmured. "The truth of angels. What is this?" "A record," Lucia said, "of miracles staged by the Church to consolidate power." Matteo's head snapped up. "You're saying the Church faked miracles?" Lucia nodded. "This book documents it all." Matteo hesitated, his fingers hovering over the book's worn leather cover. "If this is true, it's explosive, but it's also dangerous. The Vatican won't let it see the light of day." "They've already tried to kill us," Arthur said. "They'll come for you, too." Matteo exhaled, his gaze shifting between Lucia and Arthur. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we need a plan. If the Vatican knows you have this, they'll stop at nothing." "They already know," Lucia said. "We don't have much time." Matteo pulled out a laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "We need to digitize the book. Even if they destroy it, the truth will survive." Arthur watched as Matteo opened the book, scanning its pages with a portable device. The faded ink and intricate diagrams hinted at the planning behind the fabricated miracles. Arthur felt a pang of unease. This wasn't just a historical scandal. It was a betrayal of faith on a massive scale. As Matteo worked, Lucia kept watch by the window, her hand resting on a concealed dagger. The tension in the room was palpable. Suddenly, Lucia stiffened. "They're here." Arthur's heart sank. "How many?" Lucia peered through the curtains. 3 men, armed. They're checking the street." Matteo cursed under his breath. "We're out of time." "Keep working," Lucia said firmly. "Arthur and I will buy you time." Arthur blinked. "Buy time? How?" Lucia handed him a small vial. "A smoke bomb. It'll give us cover." Arthur stared at the vial. "I'm not exactly a soldier anymore." "You don't have to fight," Lucia said softly. "Just follow my lead." Matteo glanced up. "You're both insane." "Maybe," Lucia said, "but it's the only chance we have." She led Arthur to the back door, slipping into the narrow alley. The cold night air bit at Arthur's face as they moved quietly. The first man appeared at the end of the alley, his silhouette illuminated by a street lamp. Lucia didn't hesitate. She hurled the vial at his feet and a thick cloud of smoke erupted, swallowing the alley in darkness. "Run!" she hissed, grabbing Arthur's arm. They darted through the smoke, the sound of coughing and shouts echoing behind them. Arthur's legs screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept him moving. He followed Lucia through a maze of alleys, her movements swift and purposeful. "Why do you trust this journalist so much?" Arthur asked, breathless. Lucia glanced back as they slowed. "He's not just a journalist. He's part of the underground network. People like him protect truth at all costs. He's the reason some of the biggest scandals have come to light." Arthur nodded, though unease crept into his chest. "And if he betrays us?" Lucia's expression hardened. "Then we don't let it happen." When they finally stopped, Arthur collapsed against a wall, gasping. "Did we lose them?" Lucia nodded, her own breaths coming in short bursts. "For now, but we can't stay here." Arthur looked at her, his face lined with exhaustion. "How do you keep going?" Lucia met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Because the truth matters, no matter the cost." Arthur swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He nodded. "Let's finish this." Lucia helped him to his feet, and together they disappeared into the shadows, the book, and the truth still in their grasp. Arthur and Lucia pressed on through the labyrinthine streets of Rome, their breaths heavy and their bodies aching. The smoke bomb had bought them precious time, but the Custodes Veritatis would regroup quickly. Matteo's apartment and any trace of safety it offered was lost. The book had to survive, no matter the cost. Lucia stopped suddenly, pulling Arthur into the shadow of a crumbling wall. Her sharp eyes scanned the alley behind them. "They'll search every corner of the city," she whispered. "We need a safe house." Arthur leaned heavily against the wall, his chest heaving. "I'm not sure how much longer I can—" "You can," she said firmly, gripping his shoulder. "We're close." He nodded, gripping the book tighter. It felt heavier with every step, a growing burden of truth that placed both their lives in danger. The screech of tires shattered the silence. A black car sped into the alley ahead, its headlights piercing the dark. Lucia grabbed Arthur's arm and yanked him into a side street as voices shouted behind them. "This way," she hissed, leading him deeper into the maze of alleys. Arthur stumbled, his knees threatening to buckle. "I can't," he gasped. "You have to," she replied, her voice softening. "Just a little further." They reached a nondescript building. Lucia knocked in a rhythmic pattern. The door opened almost immediately, revealing an older woman with silver hair and piercing eyes. "Lucia," the woman said, her voice low and urgent, "you shouldn't have come here." "We had no choice, Amelia," Lucia replied, stepping inside and pulling Arthur with her. "They're after us, and this." She gestured to the book clutched in Arthur's arms. Amelia's gaze fell on the worn leather cover. Her eyes narrowed. "Veritas Angelorum," she murmured, her tone a mixture of reverence and dread. "Do you realize what they'll do to get this back?" Lucia nodded. "That's why we need your help." Amelia hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. The small apartment was cramped but filled with books and papers piled on every surface. Amelia bolted the door behind them and drew the curtains. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a worn sofa. "You both look like hell." Arthur sank onto the couch, his body screaming in relief. That's an understatement. Lucia remained standing, her posture rigid. "We can't stay long. They'll trace us here eventually." Amelia pulled a laptop from beneath a stack of papers. "Did Matteo manage to upload anything?" "I don't know," Lucia admitted. "We were separated before he could confirm." Amelia's fingers flew over the keyboard, her brow furrowing as she worked. After a few tense minutes, she let out a small breath of relief. "He did it. The files are on an encrypted server. They're intact." Lucia's shoulders sagged slightly. "That's something, but it's not enough." "What do you mean?" Amelia asked, her eyes narrowing. Lucia's gaze was steady. "The files might survive, but they won't mean anything unless someone tells the story. We need to go public." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. "You're talking about taking this directly to the media." Lucia nodded. "It's the only way." Amelia hesitated, her sharp gaze flicking between them. "You'll be painting targets on your backs. More than you already have." "We're already targets," Lucia said, her voice steady. "This doesn't end until the truth is out." Arthur looked down at the book in his lap, its worn leather cover now feeling impossibly heavy. "If we do this, there's no going back." "There was no going back the moment you opened that envelope," Lucia said gently. Arthur met her gaze, seeing the fire in her eyes. It reignited a small spark of resolve in him. He nodded. "Let's do it." Amelia stood, her movements quick and efficient. "I'll set up a secure connection. If we're doing this, we need to move fast." As Amelia worked, the distant sound of sirens echoed faintly through the streets. Lucia moved to the window, her hand resting on the hilt of the dagger hidden beneath her sleeve. "They're close," she murmured, her voice tight with tension. Arthur felt his pulse quicken. He had faced death before, but this was different. This wasn't about survival. It was about truth, something far larger than himself. "How much longer?" Lucia asked sharply. "Almost there," Amelia replied, her focus unbroken. "Just a few more minutes." Lucia glanced out the window. "If they find us here, we'll have no escape route." Arthur shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "And if they do get in?" "They won't," Lucia said firmly, though Arthur caught the faintest hesitation in her voice. "We won't let them." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed closer, accompanied by voices shouting in Italian. Arthur gripped the book tightly, his palms slick with sweat. He glanced at Amelia, who was furiously typing, and at Lucia, who was now gripping her dagger with white knuckles. "Whatever happens," Lucia said, her voice calm but firm, "we don't let them take the book." Arthur nodded, his resolve hardening. The truth had to survive, no matter the cost. The heavy footsteps grew louder outside Amelia's apartment, voices barking orders in Italian. Arthur clutched the leather-bound book, his hands slick with sweat. Amelia worked furiously on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Lucia stood at the window, her dagger ready, her expression calm but intense. "Time's up," Lucia said quietly, stepping away from the window. "They're here." Arthur's heart pounded. "How many?" Lucia glanced at Amelia. "How much longer?" 2 minutes, maybe less," Amelia replied, her voice tight but focused. The sound of fists pounding on the door made Arthur flinch. A deep voice barked from the other side. "Open the door! Polizia!" Arthur turned to Lucia, panic flashing across his face. "They've found us!" "They're not police," Lucia said grimly. "They'll break it down any second now." From her pocket, Lucia pulled a small vial. "Smoke bomb. This will slow them, but not for long. Arthur, stay close to Amelia. The files must go through." Arthur nodded, swallowing hard, his throat dry. He watched as Lucia moved to the door, her steps measured and deliberate. The pounding grew louder, more violent. With a swift motion, she hurled the vial at the ground. Smoke erupted instantly, thick and acrid, filling the room. "Stay low," Lucia barked. Arthur dropped to his knees, coughing as the smoke stung his lungs and blurred his vision. He could hear the door splintering, heavy boots crashing through the entryway. Shadows moved in the haze, and for a terrifying moment Arthur lost sight of Lucia. "Amelia!" he called, crawling toward the faint glow of her laptop screen. "I'm almost there." Amelia's voice came through the haze, steady but strained. "Keep them off me." Gunfire erupted suddenly, the sound deafening in the confined space. Arthur flinched as the clash of bodies and the sharp metallic clang of a blade followed. Through the chaos, Amelia's fingers never stopped moving. "Got it," she shouted. "The files are live." Relief washed over Arthur, but a shadow loomed through the smoke, heading for Amelia. Arthur scrambled to his feet, clutching the book. He swung it with all his strength, striking the intruder's head. The man staggered but didn't fall. Arthur braced for another strike, but pain exploded in his side as the man countered, sending him sprawling. The attacker raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Lucia appeared behind him, her dagger flashing. The man crumpled. "Arthur," Lucia called, rushing to his side. "I'm fine," Arthur lied, clutching his ribs. "The files." "They're safe," Lucia said, helping him up. "But we're not." Amelia grabbed a small drive from her laptop. "The files are uploaded, but this is the backup, just in case." The three moved to the back of the apartment, where Amelia opened a hidden panel in the wall. Beyond it lay a narrow passageway. "This leads to the aqueducts," Amelia said. "They won't find you there." "What about you?" Arthur asked. Amelia shook her head. "I'll hold them off. If they think the files are here, they'll focus on me." "No," Lucia said sharply. "We all go." "There's no time," Amelia replied. Go." Lucia hesitated, then nodded. She guided Arthur into the passage. Amelia sealed the panel behind them, her fate uncertain. The passage was silent, but for their breathing. Arthur's side burned, but he kept moving. They emerged into a cavernous aqueduct, water echoing softly. "Where now?" Arthur asked, his voice strained. Lucia pointed toward a faint light. "That way." They moved quickly. Arthur's mind raced. Matteo was gone, Amelia had sacrificed herself, and they were fugitives in one of the world's most secure cities. The light led them to a deserted courtyard. The cool air contrasted with the chaos they had fled. Lucia turned to Arthur, her eyes resolute. "The files are out there now," she said. "The world will know." Arthur nodded, the weight of their losses heavy. "Do you think it'll matter?" Lucia's expression softened. "Truth always matters, Arthur, even if it costs everything." Arthur looked at the book. It had survived, just as they had, but the Custodes Veritatis wouldn't stop. They had given the world a glimpse of the truth, but the fight was far from over. "What do we do now?" Arthur asked. Lucia glanced toward the horizon, where dawn's first light broke. "We keep moving. We find allies, and we make sure this never gets buried again." Arthur nodded, determination sparking in his chest. Together, they stepped into the light, ready to face whatever came next. Arthur hesitated, glancing back at the passage. "Do you think Amelia will make it?" he asked softly. Lucia paused, her voice calm but firm. "She knew the risks, but she's strong. If anyone can delay them, it's Amelia." The faint sound of distant sirens spurred them onward. Arthur tightened his grip on the book, feeling its weight but also its power. The truth had survived this far. Now it was their mission to protect it, no matter the cost. Their steps quickened as they vanished into the waking streets of Rome, their silhouettes fading with the dawn. The fight was only beginning.